Imagine it's 15 September 1986. You are a 43-year-old commercial loan officer living in Dallas, Texas. Every morning you drive past new glass towers rising out of the red dust, their windows flashing in the heat like promises that can never be broken. Your wife has clipped mortgage coupons to the fridge. Your 2 children sleep under a roof paid for by a stable salary. And $38,000 sits in your savings account because everyone says Dallas is the future. At lunch, you eat in a food court packed with surveyors, brokers, and architects, still arguing over which block of downtown will be worth the most by Christmas. Your bank keeps approving loans for office buildings, hotels, and half-finished retail centers because the last project sold fast, and the one before that sold even faster. On paper, your life looks solid, like a steel frame bolted deep into the ground. If you have ever wondered why great financial collapses so often begin in places that look perfectly ordinary, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, and it rarely announces itself with sirens. It begins quietly, behind polished lobby desks and rising appraisals, while most people are told everything is fine. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then the phone starts ringing. A developer wants more time. A second borrower misses a payment. A third says the building is open, but half the floors are dark and no new tenants are calling back. Within a few years, office vacancy in Dallas will jump from 8% in 1980 to 28% in 1987. In Houston, it will rise from 11% to 31%. The skyline that looked like proof of wealth will turn into evidence of too much debt, too much confidence, and too many bets placed on prices that were never meant to stop rising. That is the real subject of this video. Not just empty office towers, not just landlords in trouble, but the way commercial real estate can infect an entire financial system. A commercial building is not only concrete, steel, and glass. It is usually a chain of promises. A loan from a bank, rent from tenants, a valuation based on low interest rates and high occupancy, bonds sold to investors, retirement money looking for steady income, local tax revenue, small business traffic, jobs. When that chain holds, the building looks safe. When it snaps, the damage spreads far beyond the lobby. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Commercial real estate crises do not behave like house fires. They behave like bridge failures. The bridge looks strong right up to the second the weight shifts to the wrong place. For years, the pressure builds in hidden joints. Then one support gives way, and suddenly the whole structure is carrying a load it was never built to bear. That hidden pressure comes from 3 things working together. First, buildings are usually bought with debt, a lot of it. Second, their value depends heavily on income in the future, which means small changes in rent, vacancy, or interest rates can swing prices hard. Third, banks and investors often treat those values as if they were facts, when really they are forecasts wearing a suit. Think of it like this. Imagine a farmer who borrows heavily because last year the rain was good, the crop sold high, and the land appraiser says the field is worth more than ever. Then the weather changes, the crop is smaller, interest costs rise. The land is still there, but the numbers that supported the loan are gone. Commercial real estate works the same way, except the field is an office tower, a shopping center, a hotel, or a warehouse, and the weather is made of credit conditions, tenant demand, and refinancing costs. This is why the danger often hides in refinancing. Refinancing means replacing an old loan with a new one. It sounds technical, but it is simple. It is the moment the system has to admit what a building is really worth now, not what everyone hoped it was worth 5 years ago. If rents are weaker, vacancies are higher, or interest rates are much higher, the new loan may be smaller or more expensive. That gap is where the trouble lives. In good times, people step over it. In bad times, whole banks fall into it. And this brings us directly to the first part of the story. In the United States during the 1980s, the savings and loan crisis is often remembered as a story about bad regulation, reckless lending, and taxpayer bailouts. All of that is true. But one of the deepest engines of the disaster was commercial real estate. After deregulation, many savings institutions moved aggressively into acquisition, development, and construction loans. Those are loans used to buy land, prepare it, and build on it. They were supposed to be profitable. Instead, in many places, they became gasoline poured on a skyline. The Sun Belt boomed first. Arizona, California, Florida, and especially Texas seemed unstoppable. Energy money was flowing. Populations were growing. New buildings were treated like proof of demand, even when they were mostly proof that credit was easy. In the Southwest, the value of non-residential construction permits rose from $7.6 billion in 1980 to roughly $10 to $12 billion a year between 1981 and 1985. Banks and thrifts competed to lend faster. Underwriting standards weakened. That means the basic safety checks on loans became softer. More optimistic rent assumptions, more generous appraisals, more faith that tomorrow would rescue today's bad decisions. Now here's where it gets interesting. Many of these loans were non-recourse. That means if the deal failed, the borrower often did not have to personally make the lender whole. In plain English, if the building collapsed as a business, the bank could be left holding the wreckage while the developer walked away. At the same time, institutions could book fees and paper profits early, making weak loans look strong for a while. The numbers smiled before the cash did. It was like painting fresh color on rotten beams. Then the underlying economy turned. Oil prices fell. Growth slowed. Too many buildings chased too few tenants. In Dallas, office vacancy jumped from 8% in 1980 to 28% by 1987. In Houston, it climbed from 11% to 31%. In Oklahoma City, it surged from 2% to 28%. Suddenly, the towers that had looked like monuments to prosperity were giant filing cabinets with no paper inside. The rent rolls weakened. The appraisals followed. The collateral behind the loans shrank. Ordinary people did not experience this as a chart. They experienced it as silence. Elevators that no longer stopped on every floor. Contractors waiting months to get paid. Small law firms and travel agencies losing foot traffic because downtown offices emptied out. Bank employees who thought they worked in one of the safest professions in America, discovering that their own employer might not survive the year. Families who had never speculated on a single building still paid the price through layoffs, frozen promotions, and cities collecting less tax revenue just when they needed more. This is the part many people miss. Commercial real estate does not need every building to fail. It only needs enough big loans to become uncertain at the same time. Banks are confidence machines. When their assets are questioned, they stop lending. When they stop lending, businesses that had nothing to do with the original bubble begin to struggle too. A restaurant trying to expand, a machine shop rolling over a line of credit, a family business asking for working capital. The crisis moves outward like a cracked window in winter, first one corner, then the whole pane. By the end, the damage was enormous. Roughly 1,300 savings institutions failed between 1980 and 1994. The total cost of resolving the savings and loan crisis reached about $160.1 billion, including $132 billion from federal taxpayers. The lesson was brutal and simple. Empty buildings were not the real problem. The real problem was that the banking system had treated rising property values as if they were cash in the vault. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. When a city is full of cranes, glossy investor brochures, and brand new towers, do you see strength, or do you see a possible warning sign? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. The United States in the 1980s was not unique. This leads to the second part of this story, and it takes us to Japan. In the late 1980s, Japan built one of the greatest asset bubbles in modern history. Stocks soared. Land soared, confidence soared, and because land had been reliable collateral for so long, banks treated real estate like a magic mirror that could only reflect good news. If the appraised value of the land kept rising, the loan looked safe. If the loan looked safe, banks could lend more. If banks lent more, buyers could pay more for land. The mirror made everyone look richer at the same time. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the commercial land price index in Japan's 6 largest cities rose from 100 in the first half of fiscal 1983 to about 450 by the second half of fiscal 1989. That is an increase of roughly 350%. Pause on that for a second. Not a slow drift upward, not a normal cycle, a vertical leap. It was the financial equivalent of mistaking a rocket for a staircase. At first, the gains felt rational. Japan was wealthy. Its companies were powerful. Tokyo was one of the great business capitals of the world. But bubbles are dangerous precisely because they borrow the language of reality. A true story sits inside the false one. Yes, Japan had strong firms. Yes, its cities were productive. But those truths got stretched into a fantasy that land in prime areas could keep rising fast enough to justify almost any loan. Banks concentrated credit into real estate and related industries. Real estate was accepted as collateral everywhere, yet this contained a hidden flaw. If the business being financed only works when the land stays expensive, then the collateral is not a safety net. It is part of the same bet. When the land falls, the business weakens too. That means the loan is not really secured in the way lenders imagine. It is like using ice to insure against winter. The colder it gets, the less reliable your rescue becomes. The turn came after the bubble peak around 1989 and 1990. Land prices began to fall, and they kept falling. The BIS data show a continuous decline through 2003. Imagine the psychology of that. Not one ugly year, not one sharp drop followed by a quick rebound. More than a decade of gravity. More than a decade in which yesterday's collateral was weaker than the banker's spreadsheet had promised. Ordinary people in Japan felt this in slow motion. That is one reason the story is so important. Some crises explode like grenades. Japan's was more like a heavy snowfall that never stopped. Companies cut back. Banks rolled over bad loans instead of fully recognizing them. These became what many later called zombie firms and zombie banks. Zombie means still moving, but not truly alive. Businesses that should have been restructured or closed were kept going just enough to avoid admitting losses. Credit that could have gone to healthy new companies stayed trapped in old mistakes. For a salaryman in Tokyo, the damage did not always begin with a bank run or a locked ATM. It began with caution. Bonuses weaker than expected, promotions delayed, new hiring thinner than before. Families who had believed land values would support retirement or business borrowing discovered that the ground beneath those assumptions was sinking year after year. The bubble had promised momentum. The aftermath delivered stagnation, which means an economy stuck in mud. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Japan showed that commercial real estate does not need to trigger panic overnight to cause national damage. It can also trigger paralysis. If banks refuse to admit losses, if policymakers move too slowly, and if lenders keep pretending weak assets are still strong, an economy can spend years dragging around buildings that no longer match the debt tied to them. The crisis becomes less like a heart attack and more like blocked arteries. The patient survives, but the whole body grows weaker. The same mechanism was there again. Cheap credit, rising appraisals, heavy dependence on collateral, then falling values, weak balance sheets, and years of impaired lending. Different country, different decade, same machinery under the floor. And it did not stop there. Look at Sweden in the early 1990s. Financial liberalization in the mid-1980s helped trigger a rapid lending boom. Credit became easier. Real estate boomed. Investors and banks behaved as if the escalator could only move up. Commercial property prices climbed hard. Office building prices in Stockholm reached an index level of 452 in 1989. Commercial real estate prices hit 422 in 1990. Then the escalator reversed. By 1993, Sweden's commercial real estate price index had fallen from 422 to 144. That is a collapse of about 2/3. Stockholm office building prices fell from 452 in 1989 to 144 by 1993. These are not ordinary corrections. These are trapdoor numbers. They tell you the floor was never really where people thought it was. The crack became obvious in 1990 when the finance company Nickeln suspended payments after major losses on real estate loans. Soon, banks began suffering heavy losses themselves. Vacancies rose, bankruptcies rose. From March 1990 to March 1994, vacancy rates for Swedish multifamily units increased from 0.2% to 3.6%, which meant about 74,000 additional vacant units. In 1993 alone, an estimated 1,100 private rental property owners went bankrupt. Construction collapsed too. Only about 10,200 housing units were started in Sweden in 1993, after the boom years had already passed. For ordinary Swedes, the crisis was not just about landlords and financiers. It meant businesses failing on main streets, families watching unemployment rise, and a sense that institutions once treated as solid had become unstable. A real estate bust is never only a real estate bust. It is a pressure wave. It hits builders first, then bankers, then employers, then households who never signed the original speculative loans. Pain travels downhill. Sweden did something important, though, and we will come back to it later. The government moved more decisively than Japan did. On 24 September 1992, Sweden announced a blanket guarantee protecting bank depositors and counterparties. Later, it forced disclosure, separated good assets from bad assets, and recapitalized the system. By the end of 1993, the accumulated fiscal cost of support was about 74 billion Swedish kroner, equal to roughly 5% of GDP. That is a huge bill. But it also helped stop the banking system from sinking into the same long half-life that haunted Japan. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. In Texas and the wider American savings and loan crisis, too much credit chased development, vacancy rose, and banks discovered that collateral had been overpriced. In Japan, land values soared, banks treated rising appraisals like permanent truth, and the country spent years trapped under bad loans. In Sweden, Liberalized credit inflated commercial property values, the prices collapsed, and the banking system had to be rescued before the damage spread further. The same mechanism. Different countries, different decades, same result. First comes easy money or easy credit. Then comes a story people want to believe. A fast-growing region, a world-leading city, a modern financial system. That story attracts more lending. More lending pushes prices higher. Higher prices justify still more lending. At that point, the building stops being a building. It becomes a mirror reflecting the optimism of the whole system. Then one of three things changes. Rates rise, demand weakens, or lenders become less willing to refinance. Sometimes all three happen together. That is when the mirror shatters. A building that looked safe at a 4% interest cost and full occupancy can become dangerous at a 7% interest cost with empty floors. The asset is the same. The math is not. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. The disaster rarely began because bricks and concrete disappeared. The physical structure remained standing. What collapsed was the financing structure wrapped around it. Commercial real estate crises are balance sheet crises wearing hard hats. They happen when too many institutions use tomorrow's hoped-for rent to justify today's leverage. And this is why the subject matters now. In the United States, commercial property prices had fallen 11% from the start of Federal Reserve rate hikes in March 2022, according to the IMF's warning in early 2024. Moody's reported that the national office vacancy rate reached a record 20.4% in the fourth quarter of 2024. The St. Louis Fed noted that commercial real estate exposure accounted for 39% of the median bank's assets in the first quarter of 2024, and that smaller banks tended to be much more exposed than larger ones. The IMF also warned that one-third of U.S. banks, mainly small and medium-sized institutions with $3.7 trillion in total assets, had commercial real estate exposures greater than 300% of their Tier 1 capital. That phrase sounds abstract, so let me translate it. It means a very large amount of property risk sitting on a relatively thin layer of loss-absorbing capital. History does not need to repeat exactly to rhyme loudly. The rhyme today is not one country, one building type, or one dramatic headline. It is the combination: higher rates, weak office demand after the pandemic, large refinancing needs, heavy exposure concentrated in smaller lenders. That combination is the same old storm front gathering under new clouds. And look at the refinancing wall. A wall of maturities means a large pile of loans all coming due around the same time. According to the Mortgage Bankers Association, about 20% of the $4.8 trillion in outstanding commercial and multifamily mortgages held by lenders and investors will mature in 2025. That is roughly $957 billion that must be repaid, refinanced, or restructured. In a calm market, that is difficult but manageable. In a stressed market, it is like asking thousands of borrowers to squeeze through the same narrow door while lenders are checking every bag twice. This matters because commercial real estate loans do not sit evenly across the financial system. They are often concentrated in smaller and regional banks, the same institutions many small and mid-sized businesses depend on for everyday credit. A giant global bank can lose interest in a local strip mall loan and move on. A local bank with a heavy concentration in offices, hotels, or retail centers cannot move on so easily. Its fate can become tied to the health of a few neighborhoods, a few developers, and a few appraisal assumptions made in a very different interest rate world. That is one of the most counterintuitive facts in this whole subject. The most dangerous buildings are not always the ugliest ones or the emptiest ones. Sometimes the bigger danger is the building that still looks respectable, still has some tenants, still sends in rent, but no longer supports the debt structure built around it. A half-empty trophy tower can be obvious trouble. A decent-looking suburban office block financed at peak values can be quieter trouble. Quiet trouble is often worse because it gives lenders, investors, and officials more reasons to wait, and waiting has its own cost. When banks extend and pretend, which means rolling loans forward without fully admitting the losses, capital stays trapped. Capital is the cushion that absorbs losses and supports new lending. If that cushion is tied up defending old mistakes, less credit reaches new businesses, productive expansions, or healthy borrowers. That is how a property problem turns into an economy problem. The damage is not only in foreclosure, it is also in the opportunities that never get funded. This brings us to the human cost, because numbers alone can hide the real wound. When commercial real estate cracks, the first people hurt are often not the ones who caused the mania. They are the people standing closest to the credit pipe. Small business owners whose local bank suddenly becomes conservative. Pension funds that counted on supposedly steady property income. Office cleaners, security guards, receptionists, contractors, surveyors, electricians, and delivery workers whose jobs depend on buildings being full and projects moving forward. The pain does not fall evenly, it falls by proximity. Look back at Texas. When office towers emptied, it was not only developers who suffered. Downtown businesses lost customers. Banks already weakened by energy problems suffered real estate losses on top. Lending tightened. That made it harder for ordinary firms to expand or even survive. The local economy was like a tree losing sap from the trunk outward. First, the visible branches drooped. Then the smaller limbs dried too. Look at Japan. The popular image is often dramatic wealth vanishing on paper. But for ordinary families, the lived experience was slower and more corrosive. A lost decade is not a single bad year. It is years of caution settling into daily life. Fewer raises, less risk-taking. Businesses protected from failure, but too weak to invest. Younger workers entering a colder labor market than the generation before them expected. It is hard to build confidence when the economy keeps stepping on the brake. Look at Sweden. Rising vacancies and bankruptcies did not stop at the property line. They spread into employment, public finances, and trust. When 500 private rental property owners went bankrupt in 1993, those were not abstract entries in a ledger. Those were buildings, tenants, tradespeople, lenders, and neighborhoods tangled together. A property bust is like a pulled thread in a sweater. You may think it affects one corner, then the whole shape begins to loosen. And if you want one more warning from history, consider Thailand before the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Research from the Reserve Bank of Australia noted that property exposure accounted for roughly 25 to 40% of bank loans in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, with Thailand especially vulnerable because banks were heavily exposed to property developers rather than ordinary homebuyers. Bangkok had too much office space under construction. Foreign borrowing looked cheap because rates abroad were lower, and the baht appeared stable. When confidence broke, the system discovered it had built local property bets on foreign currency foundations. That is like building a tower on sand and then being surprised when the tide matters. In Bangkok, office vacancy rates were reported near 30% in 1998. Some towers were never truly finished. Some survived as monuments to the bubble itself. And again, the people paying the broadest price were not only the speculators. They were workers, savers, and businesses forced to live with the credit freeze that came after. Who walks away fine in these periods? Usually not the person who believed the boom story most completely. Usually not the institution that hid losses the longest. The groups that tend to suffer least are those with flexible financing, strong liquidity, and the ability to survive a long stretch of weak credit. In every case, the people closest to rollover risk, which means the need to refinance soon, are the ones standing nearest the edge. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the lucky, not the politically connected. The real survivors. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they respected leverage. Leverage means using borrowed money to increase the size of a bet. It can make gains look bigger, but it also makes losses hit faster. In these crises, the survivors were usually the ones who did not need perfect conditions to stay alive. They had less debt, longer funding, or enough cash flow to absorb a bad year without being forced into a bad sale. Second, they were willing to recognize reality early. Sweden is the clearest example. Instead of pretending the losses would disappear on their own, authorities forced disclosure, split weak assets from stronger ones, and recapitalized banks. The goal was to save the system, not every shareholder fantasy attached to it. Japan, by contrast, spent too long allowing bad loans to linger. Delay can feel gentle in the moment. Historically, it often deepens the wound. Denial is a soft pillow with a concrete floor under it. Third, the survivors kept liquidity. Liquidity means ready cash or assets that can quickly be turned into cash. In a refinancing crisis, liquidity is oxygen. The building may be good, the location may be good, the tenant mix may even be improving, but if a loan matures during a panic, quality alone may not save the owner or the lender. The people and institutions who endure are the ones who can wait. Time is expensive when you are over-leveraged and powerful when you are liquid. There was another pattern, too. The winners after the bust were often not the stars of the boom. In the United States, distressed assets sold through cleanup vehicles like the Resolution Trust Corporation later created fortunes for buyers who had cash and patience. In Sweden, banks that were cleaned up honestly had a better chance to function again. In every country, flexibility mattered more than brilliance. The oak that refuses to bend can split in a storm. The reed survives because it yields. Survivors also tended to understand something that booms encourage people to forget. Price is not the same as value, and value is not the same as financing. During a boom, those three words get blurred together until they seem interchangeable. If a building sells at a high price, people assume it must have strong value. If it has strong value, people assume the financing must be safe. But history shows the opposite can happen. A fine property can become a terrible investment if bought at the wrong price with the wrong debt. That is why some of the most durable players in these periods were not the most aggressive owners, but the most disciplined underwriters, the tenants with flexible balance sheets, and the buyers willing to wait until the numbers made sense again. They also avoided the emotional trap of prestige. Prestige property is dangerous because it flatters the owner. A famous tower, a prime address, a landmark hotel, a gleaming shopping center in the center of a city, these assets can seduce lenders into believing that prestige itself is protection. It is not. History keeps showing that the market can humiliate even beautiful buildings. Marble lobbies do not pay interest. Famous addresses do not refinance themselves. The survivors understood that a glamorous asset without resilient cash flow is a stage set, not a fortress. None of this is a prediction, it is a reading of the record. History shows that commercial real estate becomes dangerous when people confuse a stable-looking asset with a stable financial structure. Those are not the same thing. A tower can stand for 50 years. The loan against it can become fragile in 5. So go back to Dallas. Go back to that loan officer in September 1986, driving past towers that seemed to prove the future had already arrived. He was not looking at a ruined city. He was looking at a city still shining in the sun. That is what makes these episodes so powerful and so dangerous. The moment of highest confidence is often the moment when the hidden math is already turning. That is the lesson history keeps offering. Commercial real estate does not usually destroy economies because buildings are worthless. It does damage when debt, refinancing, and optimistic valuations are stacked so tightly that a change in rates or demand can bring the whole structure under stress at once. The crisis is rarely born in rubble. It is born in rollover risk, weak underwriting, and the long delay between a falling property market and a banking system willing to admit what it can no longer ignore. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.